This is Dimitri Lascaris from Marrakesh, Morocco at COP22. I'm here today with Anthony Hobley, the CEO of the Carbon Tracker Institute. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. A Carbon Tracker Initiative, but yes.
My apologies.
I'd love to be an institute.
So perhaps you could just, for the sake of our audience, give us a little overview of the mandate of the Carbon Tracker Initiative.
Yeah, we're a not-for-profit think tank. We are philanthropically funded. What I think is quite interesting and unique about Carbon Tracker is we're all former financial market professionals. So I'm a former sort of corporate lawyer in a global law firm. Our founder's a former asset manager from organisations like Jupiter and Henderson and the City of London. And I guess the engine room of Carbon Tracker is 8 former investment bank analysts who are ex-HSBC, Citi, Deutsche Bank, Barclays, etc. So we do investment grade financial analysis on climate risk and what that means for the financial markets and particularly the risk of the low carbon transition. So if you like, we do the numbers.
So last year I had an opportunity to interview you at COP21, and when it was over there were some rather, I would say, skeptical assessments of what had been achieved from environmental organizations, NGOs. Heads of state, particularly the large emitters, championed the agreement in part on the basis that it was going to send powerful signals to the market, to private enterprise, that the transition away from a fossil fuels economy had truly begun, and therefore investments in alternative energy sources, renewable energy sources, efficiency would be a wise, prudent, and profitable thing to do. So the question I have for you now, obviously we're taking into account that a year is not that much time to assess our progress, but do you think that we've seen real signs that that promise is being achieved, realized, and if so, what are the principal indicators of that?
Well, I think we are, and I think the fact that we are is one of the reasons we got the Paris Agreement. I think I mentioned to you last year that the big difference between Copenhagen in 2009, which as we know didn't result in a treaty, and Paris, is that the technology that's going to deliver the low carbon transition had reached a degree of maturity and the cost had dropped sufficiently that world leaders could see how they were going to deliver the commitments made in Paris. And our numbers-driven analysis tells us that we are in a technology-driven low carbon transition. So it's no longer a case of if, but it is a case of when. And that's where Paris and the signal that sends and international meetings like we're having currently in Marrakesh are important, because they're about creating the policy framework that speeds that technology transition that is already underway, sufficient that it delivers a stable climate, keeps us within the 2 degrees carbon budget.
So perhaps could you give us some examples concretely of that, a recognition within the marketplace that transition is occurring over the course of the past year?
Well, I think the speeches made by the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, the whole process he kicked off in Paris with the Financial Stability Board's Climate Risk Task Force, and the work that the financial markets are doing through that task force, led by Michael Bloomberg, to develop a set of criteria for business and the financial markets to disclose climate risk. And the seriousness, I think, with which business and the financial institutions are taking that whole process, because they understand that they need much greater transparency on that risk so they can make the right investment decisions.
Now, we all know that we, in the United States government, through the electoral process and the election that was recently held, things to be shifting in another way, at least in a major emitter, the United States. And after Donald Trump's victory in that election, one of the signs that we're moving away from that transition was that the fossil fuels stocks surged in the marketplace. How do you think, and recognizing that it's very difficult to predict at this stage exactly how this is all going to play out, but how do you think the election of somebody who can fairly be characterized as a climate change denialist to one of the major emitters, and possibly the pullout from that from the Paris Accord by that country, is going to affect the market's behavior in the years ahead?
Well, I mean, clearly on the one hand, it creates more policy uncertainty. And that actually increases the risk for investors and shareholders, and I think is a big reason why they need to take this even more seriously, because this, as I've said, this transition is going to happen, but I think the policy uncertainty that a Trump-led administration could bring increases the volatility of that transition. It increases the risk that instead of a smooth transition that we can all plan for and manage, we will get a more disruptive and chaotic transition, and that's not good for shareholders. That's not good for the financial markets, as we've seen with recent history. But I think the other point to this, coming back, to what I said, we are in a technology-led transition, and a Trump-led administration is no more going to be able to stop that than a US president could have stopped the transition from the steam locomotive to the automobile, from the typewriter to the personal computer, from the fixed line telephone system to the mobile telephone. It's about the money. And I think clearly, what our analysis demonstrates is that clean growth pays. Clean growth generates jobs. Clean growth is going to generate new businesses. Clean growth is good for economies. And I think at the end of the day, Donald Trump, President Trump elect, he's a businessman, and he understands rational business decisions, and he understands profit. And I think what we're increasingly seeing is the clean technologies are becoming the choice of profit, the profitable choice, if you like.
Now, this has been characterized as the COP of action, or at least that was the ambition. We're now about 2 days away from the conclusion of this particular COP. What signs have you seen, or major developments you've seen in terms of implementing the provisions of COP21 here in Marrakesh?
Well, I think the jury's still out. I think we'll see the final sort of. We will get a lot more transparency on Friday, Saturday, as we always do at these international negotiations. But in the area that we're following most closely around scaling up climate finance and the whole area around financial disclosures, I think we're seeing a lot of work has gone into preparing for this COP and during this COP to provide a sort of climate finance roadmap, a very concrete roadmap on how we're going to mobilise the 100 billion. And I'm chairing, a number of us from the private sector, with private sector backgrounds, are chairing a high-level ministerial dialogue this afternoon with many finance ministers on how we, one, scale up climate finance, but also use that 100 billion a year that governments are going to mobilise to leverage at least 10 times as much private sector finance, and to de-risk many of the investments even more than they already are. So I think that that for me is incredibly exciting. I mean, it's incredibly exciting for me that the public sector, through the ministers and the governments, are engaging now in this way with the private sector and private sector finance. So I think that demonstrates, I think, the pragmatism of this process, and that is a pragmatism that's going to be critical in a world where we have a President Trump.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Anthony. And this is Dimitri Lascaris for The Real News from Marrakesh, Morocco.